Hello, everyone. I'm Ryan Stubbs, NASA's Senior Director of Research, and I will acknowledge that I'm on Cheyenne and Arapaho territory here in Denver, not actually in Puerto Rico, as my background might have you believe, and as some of our other NASA staff's background might have you believe. But a tribute to Puerto Rico, which unfortunately we weren't able to make it this year, but very glad to have everyone with us today. Also want to acknowledge those marching on Washington today for racial equality. So yeah, thanks for joining NASA's Learning Series 2 for our Pivot 2 conversation. I hope that many of you were able to, and it looks like many of you were able to attend our session yesterday, which is it was an excellent conversation around field-wide implications of the current situation meaning at least the ongoing global pandemic and social reckoning around racial justice. So that 30,000 foot conversation provided some great insights around the role of arts funders, arts organizations, and artists in adapting to and influencing social change. And today we'll lower our altitude just slightly and we'll talk a bit more specifically about state arts agency adaptations in the current environment, the adaptations that you all are implementing now. And to do so, we're happy to have three examples and three great speakers. We have Victoria Panella Bourns, the director of the Utah Division of Arts and Museums. We have Sue Jens, the executive director of the Minnesota State Arts Board. And we have Michael Ibrahim, the program manager for portfolio organizations and CIP advisory services and capacity building initiatives, quite a long title, at the Massachusetts Cultural Council. So during our conversation today, we'll start off by asking Vicki, Sue, and Michael to discuss the adaptations occurring in their states and how their specific agencies have been able to pivot. Then we're going to use the magic of Zoom to place everyone into breakout groups. Hopefully some of you are familiar with how this works, but if you're not, I assure you it's not all that difficult. We'll be separated into breakout groups, and given the great turnout for our conversation, our plan here is to have 7 different breakout groups. And this will allow for more of us to share our own agency challenges, adaptations, and hopefully to have a dialogue about what we think comes next and how we will all undoubtedly evolve. So for those conversations, we've assigned note takers and facilitators for each group, and at the end we'll come back and do quick report outs. So during this time today, there'll be plenty of time for discussion, but not necessarily a Q&A, so feel free to use the chat feature at any time if you have any pressing questions or any questions that we might be able to address during or after this session. So with all of that preamble behind us, let's go ahead and get into it. So we'll start with Vicki, if you don't mind. So Vicki, recently the Utah State Legislature passed a COVID-19 Economic Recovery Program Bill, HB 5010, and it appropriated $62 million in funds, and that included $9 million for COVID-19 cultural assistance grant for a cultural assistance grant program, which is administered by the Division of the Museums, of Arts and Museums. And so we've seen a couple of these or a few of these in a handful of states, in Oregon and Vermont, I believe. And so we're seeing some of these, but could you tell us a bit more about how this occurred in Utah and how your agency is adapting to serve organizations across the state?
Thank you. Everyone joining today has great stories to tell, and I appreciate the opportunity to share ours with you. As mentioned, during the June 18th special session, our legislature allocated $9 million in grants to cultural organizations with annual budgets of more than $5 million. The funding, known as Create in Utah, is targeted for programs that boost tourism and help local economies recover. So the success of this initial Create in Utah funding helped the legislature allocate an additional $7.5 million last week in another special session. for organizations that weren't eligible for this first round. So we're really fortunate to have elected officials that understand the importance of our cultural community. And I believe this occurred because we had a base of trust. We demonstrated how the cultural community impacts economic recovery and dedicated and constant advocacy efforts from our parent agency, the Department of Heritage and Arts, from our statewide advocacy group, the Utah Cultural Alliance, and from the field. In 2016, Jill Remington Love was appointed by the governor to serve as the executive director of Heritage and Arts. And so she sits on his cabinet. During this time, the majority of state funding for arts and culture was based on direct line items from the legislature. Jill understood the need for equitable government support for arts and cultural organizations. She was able to receive our governor's support to add funding to our budget, which meant we could all speak publicly with the legislators about the request and the need. So in 2017, we shared a thought experiment with our legislators. What would it take for our agency to fund our cultural community the way the legislature funded a few organizations through line item allocations? We ended up articulating a need for $8 million annually for grants. And this was based on the overall expenditures of our cultural community times 3%. So in 2016, our division awarded $1.7 million in grants. Today, we have $3.5 million in our grants budget. And I believe we gained this increase through our diligence, dedication to telling the story of our cultural community. And now that we're experiencing the crisis of COVID-19, of how many of our performing groups were the first to shut down and are going to be the last to reopen, by outlining the losses arts and museums were experiencing, and by keeping our constituents on legislators' radars. Also, it helped that Jill has the cell phone numbers of key leadership on her phone. In addition to the increase to our base grant budget, the legislators, as I said, responded to this crisis with the added $9 million in June and now $7.5 million last week for everyone else. And some of our legislators serve on boards of arts and museum organizations. I'm sure that happens in your states as well. And they speak out for these groups. In addition, donors to our legacy groups are also donors to political campaigns, and they also have strong voices. So these influences help to guide funds flowing to our cultural community. You know, we've heard from legislators that they trust our agency to distribute funds statewide. And that this trust is based on building relationships and being transparent with legislative leadership. We've been going into detail on our process and describing our criteria to help build this trust. We have adapted our grants process, so 90% of our funds go to general operating support. And our criteria for general operating support has expanded. We allocate extra points for rural organizations, recognizing they do not have funding resources found in our urban areas. We allocate extra points for demonstrated work in inclusion, equity, diversity, and accessibility. And these extra points are translated into more money for those applicants. We share details from our review process, including operational budgets, an economic indicator, and all the scores, including the rural and the IDA scores mentioned earlier of each applicant. Our process is now totally virtual. While we miss seeing everyone in person, the process works virtually. We respond to legislative questions as soon as possible. We attend committee meetings in person or virtually in order to better understand the legislative concerns. And our constituents are helping us build this trust as well. A colleague of mine, while advocating for a specific line item to the legislature this winter, actually advocated for our general operating support grants and told legislators that these funds were more important to her than her organization's ask. Now, this type of response is just gold, and I believe we have earned the trust of our cultural community and legislature. Other changes we implemented for this Create in Utah grants included asking for documentation that organizations had over $5 million in operating expenditures. We also asked about losses due to COVID-19. In addition, our grants team worked so diligently so that it only took 9 weeks from the moment we were allocated the $9 million to sending out the award letters. 15 organizations were awarded funds from $200,000 to $1 million. These organizations must use at least 50% of the funds on projects that support opening, tourism, and community engagement. So for example, the Utah Symphony Utah Opera received $1 million. Half, or $500,000, can go directly towards their general operating expenditure. And $500,000 is more than 3 times more than the $160,000 our agency would have been able to give them in general operating support. So that's my story for today.
Great, thanks so much, Vicki. So we're just going to go through and hear from each of our presenters. So next, Sue. So the Minnesota State Arts Board was able to almost completely revamp its grant-making portfolios to react to COVID and social unrest in a very short amount of time. Could you explain this change and how it occurred and some of your early thoughts?
Sure, Ryan. Thanks a lot. Good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be with you and have a minute to share a little bit about our pivot story, and I'll look forward to hearing your pivot stories when we get into the breakout sessions. I think it's important to start with the why, and then I'll talk a little bit about what we did and how we did it. So in Minnesota on March 6th, we had our very first diagnosed case of COVID-19. 11 days later, our governor and the Department of Health issued a stay-at-home order, shutting down everything except essential businesses. So 11 days in, we had 60 cases and no deaths at that point, but Minnesota is taking a very proactive and aggressive approach to slowing the spread of COVID. Obviously, like other places, that meant that the arts community shut down. 1,900 arts organizations, more than 100,000 artists and creative workers, hundreds of thousands of activities immediately shut down. That stay-at-home order was supposed to last for 10 days. It actually lasted for 3 months. And now 5 months in, we are in a stay safe, but still arts activities are really not happening yet. A few are starting, but most are not happening. So what we did and why we did it was really based on that. We understood that for the arts community, it was not going to be business as usual this year. And so as a state agency whose job it is to make the arts available to all Minnesotans, we knew that it couldn't be business as usual for us either. So 2 days after the stay-at-home order went into effect, we issued a very simple survey and used a lot of our partner organizations to get the word out, asking people to tell us how had they initially been impacted by COVID, what was happening, and what could we do that would be most helpful to them at this moment. And we were overwhelmed with responses, 2,000 responses in the first week and more later, pardon me. And the overwhelming message, as you might imagine, was we need financial support and we need flexibility. We don't know what's ahead of us. So about 2.5 weeks later, we held a special board meeting, and our board decided to suspend 9 of our 10 existing grant programs. And the one program that we are continuing this year is our general operating support program, which makes sense. That's what people need at the moment. We're taking the money that we would have put into those other 9 programs, and we've repurposed it into 2 flexible pseudo general operating support programs, one for individuals and one for organizations. Like other states, our budget in Minnesota is still in flux. Our revenues are decreasing for the state, and we don't yet know where the bottom is here. But in July, we got some sense of what our budget might look like, so we rolled these 2 programs out. And I think at some point, you'll see a link to information about both of them. We named them creative support programs because we wanted to capitalize on the idea that people who work in the arts are creative, and they think about ways to adapt to new situations and problems. So in our creative support for individuals program, we're going to make, for us, small individual grants. It's about $6,000 per grant. We've put about $2.7 million into that program, so we're thinking maybe 450 grants will be awarded. That's twice as many as we normally do. In our Creative Support for Organizations program, those grants are also for us are small. They're $15,000 grants, about $7.5 million. So again, about 450 grants or so. So we're trying to make smaller grants, but reach a wider swath of the state. We're also, based on our history, based on the data that we have and what we know about our state, we are prioritizing 3 groups that have had fewer access to resources and to arts opportunities, and they will sound familiar. I'm sure many other states have the same groups. For us, it's Greater Minnesota, rural communities. It's BIPOC individuals and organizations led by persons of color, and it's also individuals with disabilities and organizations that provide programming or services, arts services for people with disabilities. When we have a grant program, we always establish an outcome that Minnesotans can expect from that program, and for us, the outcome is the same for both of these programs. That artists, culture bearers, arts organizations will maintain their relationships and connections to Minnesota residents and communities. Our mantra is that public funding must benefit the public, and that taxpayer dollars for the arts are meant to enrich the lives of Minnesota residents and strengthen our communities. So we think that by helping artists, creative people, creative organizations stay relevant and meaningful to their audience, to their students, to their participants is what will help them adapt and sustain themselves, not just during the pandemic, but also really chart a course for what might come next. And I will stop there and look forward to more conversation.
Great, thanks so much, Sue. Now, moving on to Michael. Michael, you run the Safe Harbors program at the Massachusetts Cultural Council, a program that addresses the immediate needs of your grantees through financial assistance, technical assistance, and capacity coaching. Could you tell us a bit more about the program and how it fits into your council's strategy to serve organizations?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, everyone at NASA and everyone on the call for holding space for this conversation. It's great to see you spend Friday afternoon with my NASA family here. I live in Boston on the traditional homelands of the people of the Pawtucket and the Massachusetts Nation. When we looked at pivoting to the Safe Harbors program, which I'll talk about in a minute, I like to talk a little bit about to contextualize that program based on our existing grant making and our existing value system that we have. So the cultural investment portfolio that was mentioned earlier is our general operating support program. We have project support in there as well. We base our operating support program on trust-based philanthropy principles. And for us, that includes ongoing operating support without evaluations or applications for an existing subset of our portfolio. We simplify and streamline paperwork needed for compliance where we can. We are transparent with our grantees whenever those will change and give a lot of lead time for that. We solicit and act on feedback. So whenever there's a change, the first step is always bringing our community into those conversations early and then soliciting feedback and then actually acting on it. And then what we say at the council for all of our grant programs is that they're all wrapped in a service of some kind. And so our grants are not transactional. They are definitely part of relationship building for us. So it's already part of our DNA. We already offer services, particularly for our organization support. We have a long history of financial management, leadership transitions, emergency preparedness, cash flows, scenario buildings, workshops for our all-volunteer organizations, and so on. So it's really baked in our DNA and value system of mutual trust, equity, humility, transparency, shared expertise between us and our grantees, and our collaboration. So I'd like to just to frame that just a little bit before we pivot to our safe harbor. As was mentioned, it really came fast and furious out of March. Our organizations closed, of course, right away. And so we immediately thought about how we can serve our field in that very specific moment. And so we conceived and mobilized Safe Harbors with our partner, the Nonprofit Finance Fund. Many of you are familiar with NFF. And so we worked with them for many years, and they are our partner in capacity building and financial instruction. And so the concept of safe harbor, literally we're on the ocean here, so we love nautical terms, is to find a way to help organizations anchor until it's feasible to re-engage with operations. It looks different for every organization, but we were really concerned about helping organizations look at their baseline operation, their essential functions like relationship management, facilities, human resources, communication, and the back office. And so we created a series of work that helped organizations first think about their emergency cash flows. Year to year doesn't help us here. It's week to week or day to day. So we partnered with NFF to create all those templates and materials and tools to help organizations figure out their day-to-day cash flows. Also help organizations think about their priorities. Is it money, or is it mission, or is there a combination of that? What are the questions needed to be asked on the governance and the staff levels? Building out the different what if scenarios. What if social distancing lasts a year, 2 years, and so forth. And then crafting a budget that aligns with each one of those scenarios. So when that scenario happens, they can pull that budget in and implement it. Right now, we're talking with organizations who are safe harboring, or as we call it, soft landing, which is our term for looking at mergers or closures or acquisitions. And then communicating with stakeholders and telling those stories very early. So for us, that was 16 webinars at the beginning of March, right out of the gate. We had 2,000 participants. 25% were not our grantees. These were open to any nonprofit in Massachusetts, but we didn't turn anybody away. You can actually get all the videos, and when we come back from the breakouts, I'm going to share our blog post that has all the materials in it. We actually created separate tracks for all of our volunteer organizations, for our organizations that had to steward facilities, and our organizations that already had existing levels of debt coming into the crisis. We were able to secure group coaching sessions with the Nonprofit Finance Fund and us around common challenges. So our organizations who were seasonal in business model on the Cape or the Berkshires or any other area, maybe our community arts education organizations that were focused on providing educational content. We have several organizations that were in the middle of a leadership transition and had to navigate this as well. So they had individualized needs. We actually set up a series of office hours, so 60-minute consulting, coaching sessions with leaders who just needed some questions answered and high-level strategy, and then a series of 6-hour consulting sessions with board and staff around really getting into some of the difficult questions and facilitating that conversation. In addition, like all of you, we streamlined all of our grant-making processes to the end of the year. We really try to get out of the way for organizations as much as we can. And I do want to give a credit and a huge thanks to our governing council, our senior staff, and our former executive director, Anita Walker, for their vision and leadership to really allocate those resources and support that work immediately, because it was within a few days to weeks of that. We did a series of webinars on PPP and CARES Act. 100% of our people who attended that webinar were successful with their PPP allocations. So we were excited about that stat. And then the final thing I'll say is that this was an extension of something that we have called the Capacity Accelerator Network. We were already working with organizations that had bubbled up of financial need. We have a financial health analysis, a rubric. We have a lot of materials where we monitor our financial health of our organizations. And so this was a natural place of trust for us to start reaching out and helping these organizations craft their strategy forward to sustainability.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Michael. So yeah, I think we have a diversity of situations here that we've heard from, and we have a few minutes before we're scheduled to go into breakout groups. So I maybe just wanted to ask one question of you three. So even though these are different types of situations or programs, one common theme that I'm hearing is that we're seeing some streamlining of being able to get dollars out the door, and also wanting some different mechanisms being placed so that those dollars can reach different communities, or underserved communities, maybe even more so than they were already. Can any of you speak to whether or not you think some of those changes will be permanent and lasting, or is there sort of a timeline to them?
Well, this is
Brian, this
Vicki.
is Sue. I can. Oh.
Let's see.
Yeah, how about Sue and then Vicki?
Okay, I'll be very quick. Um, what I will say about our changes is that the idea of having priority groups and trying to drive more resources to groups that have had fewer resources is the first step in what we expect to be a longer term and more steps. I can't say that these general fund programs that we have now will stay with us long term, but they're here for now.
So this is Vicki. I think we're learning a lot every time we do a new grant process, which seems to be every week now. We're learning a lot, and I think we're going to take those learnings as we go forward. I mean, we figured out ways to distribute emergency funding to individual artists, which we never did before, and we want to move that forward definitely in our process. And I echo a lot of what Sue said as well. I think we feel the same way. We want to keep reaching out into the community and make sure that everybody is benefiting.
Sure.
Yeah, and I'll just say on our side, again, with our DNA, it's always about what kind of services are we going to package with this grant. They're two in one. And so we're looking obviously internally in our work and our strategies and our grant making process, but also enlisting the support of our grantees that we have to understand who's around and who do we need to talk to, what places are we not in, who are those communities that maybe are dubious of state government. And so maybe through a service, we start building the relationship will then lead to grant.
Great. So yeah, I think this initial conversation has really gotten our juices flowing, and hopefully we are all ready to participate. And now is the time where we're going to be hearing from all of you and going into breakout rooms. So we'll be randomly assigned into breakout rooms. And again, each room will have a moderator. And just to give you the couple of question prompts that we'll have as we go in so you can start thinking. The first question prompt will be, are there any adaptations to your programs and services that have been particularly successful or unsuccessful that you'd like to share? And the other one is, how are you planning for what comes next? And do the lessons that you've learned now, are they going to be useful going forward? So with that, we'll go into breakouts. We'll reconvene at 3:55 Eastern. I believe you get a 1-minute warning when things are about to reconvene. So please wrap up at that time, and then we'll share a little bit about what we all talked about at that time.
I've been generous and given you all 2-minute warning. So I'm going to go ahead
Wow.
and open all the rooms now.
All right, so I think, Eric, if I'm correct, we have all been forced back into the main room at this point. Are we still waiting?
We are all back in the main room at this point.
All right. Great. So I know that we thought we had enough time for conversations, but of course we never have enough time for all the things we want to talk about. So our goal here now would just to be hearing from each group, just some highlights of the conversation in a couple of minutes if possible. And I believe we have assigned folks. So the order I would like to go in would be Phoebe, then Declan, then Katie, then Patricia, then Sue, then Eric, and then me. And then I will attempt to pull together any themes that might be coming out and wrap up. So, so first, Phoebe, would you mind reporting out from your group's discussion?
Hello, everybody. Thanks, Ryan. I was hoping to follow everybody, but I guess I'll go with this. So I have just tried to keep it very succinct to the emerging themes, and some of the highlights were having high-touch relationship with grantees, and that was one of the four the most important takeaways that I got from a couple of states discussing. as well as re-envisioning public programming was another highlight. And of course, a lot of money talk and a lack of that, but operating from that space and doing the best for the grantees and letting them know about what's going on, as well as another important theme that came up was creating space for collaborations and partnerships in this time. Yeah, I have a lot of dollar signs, but not so good conversation around that. But yeah, I think that pretty much sums up all the highlights that I had. Thanks, Ryan.
Thanks. Declan.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Ryan. We had a great discussion moderated by Vicky, so I hope to do justice to it. We kind of broke our discussion into the big challenges that everyone faced and then the opportunities that came from those challenges. So the first of all, the challenges that I think everyone's facing, we can all feel, is that uncertainty. How do we move to remote working? How do we deal with changed grant cycles, different budgets? How do we provide examples of successful programming that's virtual? How do we pivot to all these new regulations, pivot to dealing with COVID, pivot to dealing with the moment, whether it's dealing with systemic inequality, healthcare, all of that, and how do we juggle all these things? But then we moved on to opportunities to talk more about what we can do, what we can make of this moment. And that was a great conversation where we talked about how a couple of the SAAs are going through strategic planning right now, and this offers the opportunity to incorporate the chaos of the moment and make it into something that says, okay, we can plan for this in the future. We can do things with this. We can gauge how we have interacted with this moment. We're also looking at how all of this chaos leads to a space where we can be more innovative, more experimental, lets programs that are still maybe in a pilot phase get pushed out and make it work during this time. So I think while there were challenges, this opportunity of the moment is really kind of what we highlighted at the end.
Great. Katie.
Hi. We had some similar comments as Declan shared just now. What kind of stood out to me for some of the things that we talked about, and of course anybody from my breakout session number 7 can add on to this as well. A lot of the people reported that they wrapped up their current grants pretty quickly and got out of their office quickly and did a quick pivot to where they looked at and reassessed and reflected on what programs might work, what programs they needed to kind of change up a little bit to fit the needs. Some of our breakout session members were also going through strategic planning and so have taken the moments to kind of regroup. And they said that it's actually kind of a silver lining that they have wanted to re-strategize for a while now, but this gives them the opportunity to do so. A lot of people are taking advantage of the opportunity. Rhode Island is looking at this as leveraging the crisis. What can they do to change things up that have maybe been set into ways for 50+ years or so? Our members have had to become tech savvy quickly. That was kind of something that came up from all of them. And in particular, what I really love to hear is that a lot of them are connecting to their constituents in new ways through opening space for longer conversations on the telephone, having daily check-ins with all their constituents, asking them what they need from them, and trying to, as they look forward, meet the needs of their constituents in new ways as well as efficient ways with the dollars that they get.
Great. Thanks, Katie. Patricia, how about your group?
Sure thing. So now as the 4th person, it gets to be the same, a little bit of repetition. We definitely talked about sort of the quick pivot to change and loosen eligibility requirements, matching requirements, that sort of thing that everybody sort of quickly pivoted to. And also definitely came up that one silver lining is just having more communication, more conversations with constituents. Pennsylvania just wrapped up a whole slew of community conversations. Paul in Delaware has been having one-on-one Zoom calls with a bunch of grantees. And I also wanted to just point out that in some states, there have been requests and then subsequent funding going to the arts from general CARES Act funding that the state has received. So that was definitely a question and an interest to think about ways to talk with the legislature or put in requests. And NASA, if you have questions about that, NASA can definitely answer those questions and help you through that process in your state. Another thing that we touched on is just the needs of different types of organizations and individuals. You know, individual artists are thinking about copyright material online and how that's shifting for them. Obviously, performing arts have really different needs than visual arts organizations at this time. Another thing that we talked about was looking more at racial equity. You know, this is a time of great change in a lot of different ways, and since things need to change already, it's really a moment to shift internal practices, looking at positions that can perhaps change to also include and focus on anti-racism, diversity, equity, and inclusion in different ways. Other public projects that can bring attention to specific issues of equity or issues of race. In Oklahoma, for instance, there's the centennial of the race massacre in Tulsa, and how that is now going to be expanded as, you know, something that needs to be thought about and highlighted statewide, not just in Tulsa, and also nationally. So yeah, that's sort of what we talked about. If anybody else from my group wants to shout out anything that I missed, please do so.
Hey, thank you. Sue, how about your group?
Yeah, we also had a pretty robust conversation mentioning many of the things that have been mentioned. Just the way that state arts agencies have been able to just pivot, like as the name of this session states, in these circumstances is just awesome and amazing to me. Things that were mentioned included making sure that individual artists were able to get grants, and a few states mentioned that. Of course, making the grant process more flexible and accessible and more transparent for grantees or potential grantees. There was an emphasis on not only racial and ethnic equity, but also ability. You know, trying to ensure people had access to the funds and to the technology. All the you know, video technology is not necessarily accessible to everyone, so that was an important factor mentioned on the state. Also, I'll reiterate the tactic of having town hall meetings, cohort meetings, yes, online, but you know, that really helped unite the constituents and help connect the constituents not only with the state arts agency, but with each other. And you know, that proved to be really worthwhile for several states. And the constituents tended to be pretty impressed with state arts agencies who were able to pull those kinds of meetings together, which are many state arts agencies, obviously. So I would say those are the main things. And of course, you know, as far as the future goes, as has been mentioned, just trying to keep making, you know, another look at the processes for grant making, trying to make them more transparent, more accessible, more equitable in the future. It's given some state arts agencies an opportunity to think that through as well.
Great. And then Eric.
Thank you. As Patricia mentioned, almost everything we talked about has been mentioned in some form or fashion, but to go in a little more detail, we did talk a little bit about some interesting ways people were, you know, distributing CARES funds to their groups, and how there are more than one way to do that, whether that's directly to organizations you're already funding, or finding a way to actually engage different organizations and people to fund that way. We talked a lot about pivoting from project-oriented grants to more general operating support grants, and how that was a necessary pivot. I think the underlying factor in all the funding we talked about is trying to find a way to be most relevant and have the biggest impact possible in a time of crisis for the sector. I think the other big theme that really came out was about connection and communication. So whether it was Julie and me talking about monitoring the health of the sector and communicating and keeping a constant eye on the pulse of what's going on, to how failures of communication cause problems, to just the fact that people are connecting with longtime supporters, grantees, people in the field, and maintaining those connections in this time. As well as, Chris from Kentucky was talking about how just the connections between staff members at the state arts agency is important, how ramping up and having more communications and more calls is really important for mental health and keep people feeling motivated to work within the state and for the organization itself. And all that with an eye towards not experiencing Zoom fatigue from too many meetings taking up too much time. If there's anyone else in my group that has some other comments, or if I've missed something, please feel free to throw that up in the chat, because I know I glossed over a lot of the depth we actually got into.
Great. So thanks, Eric. Just to give a quick synopsis of our group's conversation, we talked about how in Illinois there is the importance of partnerships to come together to put together some relief funding in a very short amount of time, or relatively short amount of time. And we also talk about the challenges of being in state government and doing things as quickly as we would like to do. Talked about how in Alabama they were able to do some streamlining to get their dollars out a bit as quickly as possible to grantees. And also I think there's this idea of how do we fund some of the innovations that we want arts agencies to do? Where is their funding available? Even in our grant programs that we already have, that allow for organizations to use the fund to fund new technology, to do the types of programming that's a bit different. Also, I think we heard in Hawaii that there was some sort of positive collaborations that were going on, allowing for more communications via technology that may have been happening in person, and some interesting collaborations between agency programs in public art and within teaching artists, and allowing for more public art to be exposed, at least virtually, via teaching artist lessons. Another thing in Wisconsin, I think one thing we talked about was the listening session. So that's another theme that we've heard, listening being important and flexibility being important for grantees that have new ways of doing business, or hey, will have a similar grant program, but the way that grantees are able to operate is no longer the same, right? So allowing some flexibility for grantees in presenting the information and presenting their application in a way that may not be the same, but we know we still want to support this organization. So I think one thing that's encouraging from this conversation is that, we had 7 different groups. We heard from 3 different states in the beginning. We heard, I think, a really wide range of things that are happening, but we are also seeing a lot of similarities in themes that you are having, which I think speaks to the importance of having these types of conversations. So if I would just try to summarize some of the major themes that I saw, or that we all just heard, you know, I think one is that we want to understand how to fund organizations in a way that is going to meet the challenge of the current times. That includes getting dollars out to um, diverse communities, to still being able to serve the entire state, but having even more of a focus on equity and serving perhaps underserved areas and underserved populations. So I see that as something that's been a change, a necessary change, and is also something that is likely going to continue as we um, adapt to the new normal and move on from this, hopefully at some point. Um, Also, I'm seeing this theme of flexibility and streamlining within the grant making process, which I think a lot of folks have wanted to do for quite some time, and this opportunity has allowed for more of that to happen, and perhaps that's something that continues over time. Um, and I think, you know, there's uncertainty, right, that we continue to see, um, and that we still are living in a very uncertain time. So the data that we receive and the information that we receive over the next few months is going to be really important to understanding how there's going to be long-term effects on state arts agencies. So at that, I think we are at time. Is that correct, Eric?
Yes,
All
that's
right.
correct. We are at time.
All right. So just thanks so much for all of your input and holding this conversation and bringing your big brains to help all of us hopefully think through some of these issues that we're commonly facing. Wish everybody well, and hope to see you in person or virtually soon. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.